The iron gates stood 3 meters high, their hinges rusted into permanent silence, welded shut by time and something far more deliberate. Behind them, the remains of New Providence Colony waited in the South Pacific humidity, vine-choked and forgotten, until a research expedition in 1947 cut through the lock and discovered what 100 years of isolation had preserved. This is the story of how 400 colonists chose to seal themselves away from the world during the Great Famine of 1846, and what that choice cost them. The expedition leader, Dr. Thomas Merrick from the University of Sydney, recorded his first impressions in a journal that would later be sealed by court order. "The smell hit them first," he wrote. "Not decay exactly, but something older, like the air inside a crypt that had forgotten what wind felt like. Then the sound, or rather its absence. No birds called from the palms overhead. No insects hummed in the underbrush. Even their footsteps seemed to die in the thick silence that hung over the compound like a shroud." New Providence had been established in 1838 by the Colonial Development Company, a British venture promising land and prosperity to families willing to brave the Pacific frontier. The colony occupied 17 hectares on an unnamed island chain, positioned along trade routes that should have made it wealthy. Instead, it became a grave. The gates had been closed from the inside on March 15, 1846, according to shipping records from the mainland. The last supply vessel reported all inhabitants healthy, stockpiles full, no signs of distress. Captain Harold Webb noted in his log that the colonists seemed unusually eager for the ship to depart, nearly shoving his crew back to the longboats before the tide turned. After that, nothing. Ships passing the island over subsequent decades reported seeing smoke from cooking fires, occasional figures moving behind the gates, even laundry hung to dry on lines strung between buildings. But no one answered hails, no boats launched to request supplies. The colony existed in a state of visible inhabitation and absolute silence that unnerved every sailor who witnessed it. By 1850, most mariners avoided the island entirely, spreading stories about plague or madness or both. By 1870, the Colonial Development Company had written off their investment and forbidden any rescue attempts. By 1900, New Providence had been forgotten by everyone except cartographers who marked it with a small notation: "Abandoned settlement, no landing recommended." Dr. Merrick's expedition changed that. Hired by the British Colonial Office to document defunct settlements before transferring Pacific territories to local governance, his team expected to find weathered buildings and perhaps a few scattered bones. What they discovered in the first courtyard made his assistant, a young archaeologist named Patricia Chen, vomit into the hibiscus bushes. 17 skeletons sat in a perfect circle, hands bound behind their backs with rope that had petrified over the decades. Each skull showed identical damage, a single crack at the base, the kind produced by an executioner's blow. The ground beneath them was stained dark, the iron-rich soil permanently discolored by what had soaked into it a century before. Before we go deeper into what happened behind those gates, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in archive boxes for over 70 years. The expedition spent 3 days cataloging the courtyard before moving deeper into the compound. The colonial buildings formed concentric circles around a central meeting house, a design meant to foster community and shared governance. Instead, it had created a panopticon where everyone could watch everyone else, where privacy became impossible, where suspicion could metastasize without relief. The second discovery came in what had been the colony's storehouse. The door had been barred from the outside, heavy timber beams wedged across the entrance, with the kind of desperate strength that suggested whoever installed them never intended them to be moved. It took Merrick's team 4 hours to dismantle the barrier using crowbars and brute force. Inside, They found 93 skeletons piled against the far wall like cordwood. Unlike the executed circle in the courtyard, these bodies showed signs of prolonged suffering. Fingernails were broken and bloody from clawing at the wooden walls. Teeth marks scored the door where people had tried to chew their way to freedom. The floor was littered with scraps of clothing that had been torn apart and chewed, with wood splinters that had been gnawed in desperate attempts to find anything at all to consume. They had been locked in and left to starve, while the storehouse around them remained half full of preserved food. Chen found the first journal wedged behind a water barrel, its leather cover mildewed but intact. The entries were written in 3 different hands, passing the book between authors as one after another lost the strength or sanity to continue. The opening pages described the famine that had struck the mainland, the riots in port cities, the breakdown of supply chains that had left New Providence isolated and afraid. We have made the difficult decision. Read the entry from March 15, 1846, written in the precise script of someone named Thomas Whitfield, colony administrator. The gates will be sealed until the famine passes. We have supplies for 8 months if rationed properly. This is not abandonment of the outside world, but preservation of our community for the future that will come. What Whitfield didn't mention was how they would decide who deserved to eat from those carefully rationed supplies and who would be sacrificed to ensure the rations lasted. But the research team was about to learn exactly how those decisions were made. The meeting house stood at the colony's center, its doors hanging open to reveal rows of benches facing a raised platform. On that platform sat a single chair, and on that chair rested a leather-bound ledger 3 times the size of the first journal. Dr. Merrick opened it with hands that had started to shake, though he wouldn't admit why until much later. The ledger was a record of judgment. Each page bore a name, a date, and a single-word verdict. The handwriting matched Thomas Whitfield's entries from the smaller journal, but here his precision had calcified into something mechanical, ritualistic. 347 names filled the first half of the ledger. Beside each, approved or rejected. The approved names appeared in neat columns, orderly as soldiers. The rejected ones were crossed out with thick black lines that tore through the paper like wounds. Dr. Merrick's team would spend the next 6 weeks trying to understand the system behind those judgments, and what they discovered would challenge every assumption about human behavior under extreme pressure. The colony had begun with a vote. On March 16, 1846, the day after sealing the gates, every adult colonist gathered in the meeting house to establish what they called the Preservation Council. 7 members, elected by simple majority, tasked with managing resources and maintaining order until supply ships could safely return. The minutes from that first meeting, preserved in a separate document box, read like any other civic proceeding. Motions made, seconded, approved. Resolved, that daily rations shall be reduced by 1/4 to extend supplies. Resolved, that all food stores shall be secured under council supervision. Resolved, that those who waste or steal provisions shall face immediate sanctions. The word sanctions appeared 14 times in the first month's minutes. It was never defined. Patricia Chen found the definition in the storehouse, where 93 skeletons testified to what sanctions meant. Among the bones lay scraps of paper, notes that had been passed between the dying, messages scratched into wooden beams with fingernails and desperation. One, written on the back of what appeared to be a rationing card, contained just 7 words. They said we ate too much. We didn't. The Preservation Council had created a system of measurement. Every colonist received a weekly evaluation based on work contribution, resource consumption, and what the ledger termed community value. Those who scored above the threshold continued receiving full rations. Those who fell below faced progressive penalties, reduced portions, then public reprimand, then imprisonment in the storehouse. The first executions happened in late April, 6 weeks after the gates closed. From the Ledger, April 23, 1846. Edmund Clark, age 47. Rejected. Charge: repeated theft of preserved meat. Sentence carried out at dawn per council, vote 5-2. Edmund Clark's skeleton was the third from the left in the courtyard circle, identifiable by the copper buttons from his coat scattered among his ribs. His crime, cross-referenced with other documents, amounted to taking 3 extra strips of dried fish over 2 weeks. Before the gates closed, such an offense would have merited a fine or extra labor duty. Behind the gates, it became a capital offense, but theft was only the beginning of what the council deemed rejection-worthy. By June, the charges had expanded. Martha Brennan, age 29, rejected. Charge: spreading dissent and questioning council authority. James Morton, age 52, rejected. Charge: failure to meet labor quota, chronic illness. Sarah and John Wickham, ages 34 and 37, rejected. Charge: concealing pregnancy, threat to resource stability. The Wickhams had tried to hide Sarah's condition, knowing that pregnancy would mark them both as drains on supplies. They'd bound her growing belly with cloth, altered her clothing, moved in ways that minimized her profile. Someone noticed. Anyway, someone always noticed. The tight geometry of the colony ensured that secrets became impossible, that surveillance became participatory, that everyone watched everyone else, because failing to report suspicious behavior could itself become grounds for rejection. They called it preservation. History would call it something else. Dr. Merrick interviewed the few elderly islanders on neighboring chains who remembered stories about New Providence, tales passed down through generations like cautionary fables. One woman, nearly 90 years old, recalled her grandmother speaking of smoke that rose from the colony at strange hours, of sounds that carried across the water on windless nights. She said they were making offerings, the woman told Merrick, said they thought if they fed the island enough souls, it would spare the rest. The research team dismissed this as superstition until they found the altar. It occupied a cleared space behind the meeting house, a raised stone platform that had been meticulously scrubbed but never quite cleaned. Scrapings from the surface revealed protein residues, bone fragments, and something else that the laboratory in Sydney would later confirm as human tissue that had been subjected to sustained heat. The second journal, discovered in a locked box beneath the altar, was written entirely by council member Victoria Ashford. Her entries lacked Whitfield's bureaucratic distance. Instead, they read like confessions recorded by someone trying to convince herself that atrocity was necessity. "We take only what we need," she wrote in July of 1846. "The rejected have already been judged unworthy of life. To allow their flesh to go to waste would be the true sin. God will understand. He must understand. We are preserving the community. We are preserving the future." The entries grew more elaborate as months passed, describing rituals that had developed around what Ashford called the necessary consumption. The council would gather at the altar after each execution. The youngest member would say prayers adapted from Scripture, rewritten to frame cannibalism as communion, survival as salvation. Then they would distribute portions according to rank, the highest value colonists receiving the most, while others watched and understood that their own value was being calculated, measured, weighed against their neighbors. How do you maintain your humanity when survival demands you surrender it? How do you look at the person beside you and see both a community member and a potential meal? These questions haunted Ashford's later entries as the system she'd helped create began devouring the colony from within. By August, the executions had accelerated. The ledger showed 3 to 4 rejections per week, the charges becoming increasingly arbitrary. Thomas Reynolds, age 41, rejected. Charge: displaying excessive fear, damage to morale. Elizabeth Crane, age 23, rejected. charge, attracting attention from multiple men, threat to social stability. Peter Fulton, age 16, rejected, charge, youth without specialized skills, future resource burden. They had moved beyond punishing crimes to eliminating anyone who represented an inefficiency, a complication, a drag on the collective survival calculation. The colony was eating itself by design, a controlled population reduction masked as justice. But the truly horrifying discovery lay not in the executions themselves, but in who had enabled them to continue. Chen found the attendance records in a separate ledger, noting which colonists had been present at each judgment session in the meeting house. The Preservation Council made their decisions publicly, requiring a quorum of at least 50 adult witnesses for each rejection vote. The record showed that attendance never fell below 70%. People chose to watch, chose to participate, chose to raise their hands when asked who supported the sentence, because not raising your hand meant questioning the council's authority, which was itself grounds for rejection. 100 people watched Edmund Clark die for stealing fish, and 100 people went home to their reduced rations, knowing they'd made the safe choice. Dr. Merrick's field notes from this period became increasingly disturbed. "We keep asking who the monsters were," he wrote on day 17 of the excavation. But the document suggests the monsters were everyone. The system required participation. Silence was complicity. Survival meant accepting that tomorrow you might watch your neighbor die, and the day after they might watch you. The council had created a machine that converted fear into permission, scarcity into cruelty, and community into cannibalism. All it needed was people willing to pull the levers, and it turned out that people were very, very willing. What happened next would reveal that even this horror was just the beginning. By September of 1846, the Preservation Council had eaten 43 people and locked 93 more in the storehouse to starve. But the colony's supplies, which should have lasted until November at reduced rations, were already running critically low. Someone had been stealing from the secured stores, taking far more than 3 strips of dried fish. The council was about to discover that the system they'd created had taught everyone exactly the wrong lessons. The council met in emergency session on September 9, 1846, with Thomas Whitfield's handwriting in the ledger growing jagged for the first time. Security measures had failed. The locked storehouse had been breached repeatedly, despite guards posted at every entrance. Someone with keys, with access, with authority, was systematically draining supplies that 400 lives depended upon. The thefts weren't desperate grabbings by starving outcasts. They were calculated, sustained, organized. Whoever was stealing knew exactly where the best provisions were kept and had been taking them for months. Victoria Ashford's journal from this period revealed the paranoia that infected the council like fever. "We have become what we judged others for," she wrote. "We who sit in authority, deciding who lives and who feeds our survival, we are the greatest thieves of all. But which of us, which of my fellow counselors, do I trust less than myself?" The 7 council members began watching each other with the same predatory attention they'd directed at the colonists. Every meeting became a careful dance of accusation and defense. Every vote carried subtext about who seemed too well-fed, whose clothing showed fewer signs of deprivation, whose children maintained suspiciously healthy complexions, while others' ribs began showing through their skin. Dr. Merrick's team found evidence of the investigation in a series of surveillance logs. The council had assigned colonists to watch each other in rotating shifts, creating a network of informants that turned neighbors into spies and friendships into strategic alliances. The logs detailed who visited whose quarters after dark, who spoke in hushed voices near the storehouse, who met in groups of 3 or more without council supervision. New Providence had transformed into a police state with a population of 400 and counting downward. The first council member to be accused was Margaret Holloway, the youngest at 31 years old. Her crime was maintaining her health too successfully. While others grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, she retained flesh on her bones, color in her cheeks, strength in her movements. The other 6 council members voted unanimously for her immediate interrogation. From the minutes of September 17, 1846, M. Holloway subjected to examination regarding suspected theft of community resources. Physical search of quarters yielded no evidence. Voted to continue observation and restrict her access to storage areas, pending further investigation. But Margaret Holloway wasn't stealing food. She was eating people who'd already been rejected. The system had created its own economy. Chen discovered the evidence in a hidden compartment beneath Holloway's quarters, a space that had been carefully concealed behind false floorboards. Inside, personal journals detailing a secret market that had emerged among certain colonists, those willing to take the cannibalism beyond the council's sanctioned rituals. They traded preserved human flesh like currency, portions hoarded from the altar distributions or taken from the storehouse corpses before they'd finished dying. They waste so much, Holloway had written. The council performs their rituals and takes their symbolic portions, but they leave meat on the bones. They lock the rejected away to starve when their flesh could sustain us. I am not stealing. I am preventing waste. I am being efficient. Her network included 17 colonists, each taking carefully calculated risks to supplement their rations with human meat obtained through unofficial channels. They developed a system of signals, dead drops, coded language that allowed them to coordinate trades without arousing council suspicion. A red cloth hung from a window meant fresh acquisition available. A white stone placed by the well meant supply needed. 3 knocks on a particular door meant meeting at the altar after dark. The black market in human flesh had its own rules, its own hierarchies, its own moral framework that justified why some cannibalism was righteous survival while other cannibalism was criminal theft. They'd created capitalism out of corpses. When the council discovered the network, they faced an impossible choice. 17 people represented nearly 5% of the remaining population. Executing them all would eliminate valuable labor and create a dangerous precedent. But allowing the unauthorized consumption to continue would undermine the council's authority and destroy the carefully maintained fiction that they were preserving order rather than presiding over chaos. Thomas Whitfield proposed a compromise that revealed how far the colony had descended into madness. On September 24, 1846, the council voted to officially sanction the market system under council oversight. Holloway's network would continue operating, but all transactions would be logged. All distributions would require council approval, and a portion of every trade would be taxed to benefit the common stores. They would regulate the commodification of human flesh the same way they might regulate wheat or timber. The ledger entries from this period abandoned any pretense of justice. Standard ration: 4 ounces preserved fish, 2 ounces grain, 1 ounce supplementary protein, human origin, council authorized. Premium ration available to high-value workers: 6 ounces preserved fish, 3 ounces grain, 3 ounces supplementary protein. They'd created a menu. Dr. Merrick's team found the official price lists posted in the meeting house. Rates of exchange between labor and food calculated with accounting precision. 1 day of agricultural work earned standard rations. 3 days earned premium. Specialized skills commanded bonuses. Carpentry added 2 ounces. Medical knowledge added 4. Council membership added 6. Children received half rations after age 10, quarter rations before. Nothing if deemed non-viable due to developmental concerns. The island wasn't preserving a community anymore. It was operating a labor camp where your value was measured in ounces of your neighbor's flesh. But the market system created new problems faster than it solved old ones. With cannibalism officially sanctioned and regulated, demand exceeded supply. The council's careful calculation of who to reject and when couldn't keep pace with the colony's appetite for human meat. They'd created a system that required regular executions to function, that needed bodies to feed the machine they'd built from desperation and buried morality. The solution they developed would haunt the expedition members for the rest of their lives. Patricia Chen found the revised council minutes from October 1st, 1846, the handwriting shaky as though written by someone whose hands had forgotten steadiness. The motion had been proposed by Victoria Ashford herself, seconded by 4 others, passed with only 1 dissenting vote. Resolved, that the system of judgment and rejection shall be supplemented by voluntary surrender. Colonists may offer themselves for rejection in exchange for enhanced rations provided to designated family members for a period of 3 months following surrender. This program shall be termed the preservation sacrifice and shall be promoted as the highest form of community service. They gamified suicide. The propaganda appeared within days. Notices posted throughout the compound, praising those who chose preservation sacrifice as heroes, martyrs, saints of the survival cause. Victoria Ashford wrote speeches comparing the sacrifice to Christ's crucifixion, to soldiers dying for their nation, to parents shielding children from danger. The council developed ceremonies around it, public gatherings where volunteers would stand before the community and announce their decision to formal applause. The first volunteer was Henry Makepeace, age 63, who surrendered himself so his daughter and 2 grandchildren could receive enhanced rations. The ledger recorded his death with the notation "honorable sacrifice" beside his name instead of the usual "rejected." His family collected their bonus portions for the next 3 months, while his flesh fed strangers who praised his noble choice. Within 2 weeks, 7 more colonists had volunteered. By the end of October, the number reached 23. The council had solved their supply problem by convincing people to become supply. But not everyone volunteered willingly. The expedition found evidence of coercion in personal letters and diary fragments scattered throughout the compound. Families were told their children would be marked as future burden unless a parent volunteered for sacrifice. Elderly colonists received visits from council representatives who explained with gentle menace that their continued consumption of resources was being noticed, that voluntary sacrifice was always available if they wished to help rather than hinder the community's survival. Some letters described being ostracized by neighbors until volunteering became the only way to regain social acceptance. Others told of council members offering to reduce sentences for minor infractions if a family member would volunteer for sacrifice. The pressure was economic, social, psychological, and ultimately irresistible for those without power or protection. One letter, written by a woman named Eleanor Price 4 days before her voluntary sacrifice, captured the impossible calculus. "They have made it so the only way I can be a good mother is to let them kill me. They have made it so refusing means being selfish, choosing means being loving. I don't want to die, but I don't want my children to starve either, so I will smile when I volunteer. I will accept their applause, and I will hate them with my last breath." Eleanor Price's skeleton wasn't in the execution circle. She'd been deemed an honorable sacrifice, which meant her remains had been fully utilized, processed, distributed, consumed, and forgotten, except for a single line in the ledger, praising her community spirit. What would you do if survival meant watching your neighbors volunteer for death, knowing that refusing to applaud their sacrifice might mark you as the next candidate? The market system and sacrifice program operated side by side through October and November of 1846, creating an economy where human life had been reduced to its caloric value and moral worth was measured in willingness to become food. The colony had achieved a kind of stability, but it was the stability of a machine designed for systematic atrocity. Dr. Merrick's psychological assessment, written after weeks studying the documents, concluded that New Providence had undergone complete moral collapse within 8 months. They didn't gradually descend into evil. he wrote. They constructed evil systematically, step by logical step, each decision justified by the one before it. The horror isn't that they became monsters. It's that they remained convinced they were heroes, even while eating each other. But the worst revelation was still waiting in the depths of the compound, in a building the expedition team had avoided until last because of what they'd begun to suspect it contained. The nursery, the building stood apart from the others, painted white when everything else had weathered to gray, its windows covered with cloth that had once been cheerful yellow. Dr. Merrick's team approached it on day 22 of the excavation, their reluctance visible in slowed steps and exchanged glances. They'd found references to the children's house in multiple documents, always mentioned briefly, always in passive voice, as though the writers couldn't bear to describe it directly. Patricia Chen had volunteered to enter first, but she stopped at the threshold, one hand pressed against the doorframe, breathing deeply before stepping into the darkness beyond. The smell told them everything before their eyes adjusted to the dim interior. 18 cribs lined the walls, handcrafted from local wood with the kind of care that spoke to better times when New Providence still believed in futures. 12 contained small skeletons, bones so fragile that Chen would later need tweezers and brushes to excavate them properly. The remaining 6 cribs were empty, their mattresses long since rotted, but the wooden frames bore scratch marks at heights consistent with toddlers trying to climb out. This wasn't a nursery. It was a holding pen. The council documents explained the children's house in bureaucratic language that made the horror almost worse through its clinical detachment. On November 3rd, 1846, facing continued resource pressure despite the sacrifice program, Thomas Whitfield had proposed what he termed developmental culling. Children under age 4 consumed resources without providing labor value. Children with disabilities or chronic illness represented long-term drains on supplies. The solution was to concentrate these non-contributing minors in a single location where their resource allocation could be optimized. Optimized meant starve to death while their parents worked in the fields. Victoria Ashford's journal entries from this period showed the first cracks in her justification framework. "I cannot write what we have done," she recorded on November 5th. "I cannot write it because writing makes it real, makes it permanent. We told the parents it was for the children's safety. We told them the little ones would receive special care, medical attention, educational preparation for when supplies improved. Some believed us, others knew. But what choice did they have except to hand over their babies and return to work? The system was elegantly cruel. Parents who refused to surrender their young children lost their own rations entirely, ensuring the whole family would starve together. Parents who cooperated received bonus portions, just enough extra to survive while their children died out of sight. The council had turned parental love into a weapon against itself. They made mothers choose between slow death together or quick death apart. The Children's House operated for 3 months under the supervision of Rebecca Stannard, a former school teacher who'd served on the Preservation Council from the beginning. Her personal diary, discovered in a locked drawer in her quarters, revealed someone slowly losing coherence as duty and conscience waged war in her mind. Day 7. The children cry less now. They've learned crying brings nothing. Little Thomas asked for his mother this morning. I told him she would visit soon. We both knew I was lying. Day 14. 3 have died. We removed them during the night so the others wouldn't see. But children sense absence the way animals sense weather. They know. They always know. Day 21. I have stopped learning their names. It's easier that way. The expedition found evidence of resistance among the general population. Notes passed between parents planning coordinated refusals. Letters describing attempted break-ins to the children's house. Plans for confronting the council that were never executed. But fear paralyzed action. Speaking against the children's house meant questioning council authority, which meant being marked. For rejection, which meant your remaining children would face even worse odds of survival. So parents watched their toddlers being taken away and said nothing. Said nothing when the crying stopped. Said nothing when small bodies were carried out under sheets. Said nothing because silence had become the only form of protection left. One mother, Anna Priest, broke the silence on November 28th when she attacked Rebecca Stannard with a kitchen knife during the morning meal distribution. The blade struck Stannard's shoulder, cutting deep but not fatally. Anna was subdued within seconds by colonists who'd grown practiced at restraining those who disrupted order. Her trial lasted 4 minutes. From the ledger, Anna Priest, age 28, rejected. Charge: assault on council member, attempted murder, threat to community stability. Sentence carried out immediately per emergency provisions. Remains distributed according to standard allocation. Anna Priest's 3-year-old daughter had died in the Children's House 5 days earlier. The council deemed Anna's grief less important than Rebecca Stannard's shoulder wound. Anna's husband, Michael Priest, was forced to attend her execution and accept his ration portion of her flesh, or face rejection himself for refusing council mandate. Dr. Merrick interviewed descendants of colonists who'd settled nearby islands in subsequent decades, some of whom had heard fragments of stories passed down through generations. One elderly man recalled his grandfather speaking of screams that carried across the water from New Providence in late 1846. Sounds that weren't quite human, that spoke of something beyond ordinary suffering. He said it sounded like the world was ending, the man told Merrick. Said it made him pray even though he'd never believed in God before. The Children's House closed in late January of 1847, not because the council developed conscience, but because they'd run out of children. 18 had entered, 18 had died. Their parents continued working the fields and attending council sessions and raising their hands to approve new rejections, because what else could they do except survive? But survival itself had become its own form of death. Patricia Chen's field notes from excavating the Children's House showed someone struggling to maintain professional detachment. "We keep finding toys," she wrote. Hand-carved animals, cloth dolls, a wooden puzzle someone made with careful attention to detail. The parents sent toys with their children because they needed to believe the lie, needed to believe their babies were being cared for, not warehoused to die. The toys make it worse somehow. They speak to hope in a place designed to eliminate it. The expedition discovered something else in the Children's House that the official records never mentioned. Behind a loose board in the back room, they found a collection of letters written by the children themselves, or rather dictated to Rebecca Stannard, in moments when duty cracked enough to allow minimal mercy. These letters were never delivered to the parents, never meant to be delivered. But Stannard had preserved them anyway, perhaps as penance or evidence or both. "Dear Mama, when will you come get me? I am very hungry. I promise I will be good. Love, Sarah." "Papa, the lady says you are working very hard. I am proud of you, Papa. Tell sister I miss her. Your son David." "Mama, I hurt. Mama, please. Mama, it is dark. Mama." The last letter was incomplete, the handwriting trailing off mid-word, as though the child had lost strength, or Stannard had lost the ability to continue transcribing. The letter was dated January 19th, 1847, 5 days before the Children's House officially closed. The child's name was Grace Whitfield, age 3, daughter of Thomas Whitfield himself. The colony administrator had sent his own child to die in the system he'd created. This discovery fractured the expedition's understanding of the power dynamics at New Providence. They'd assumed the council members had exempted themselves and their families from the worst measures. That authority meant protection. But the documents suggested otherwise. 7 council members had sent a total of 9 children to the Children's House. They'd subjected their own families to the same culling logic they'd imposed on others. Whether this made them more principled or more monstrous became a subject of debate among the research team that would never reach consensus. Thomas Whitfield's ledger entries from January of 1847 showed someone whose handwriting had degraded from precise bureaucracy to barely controlled scrawl. Grace died this morning. Rebecca says she asked for me at the end. I was in the meeting house approving rations. I was doing my duty. This is what duty costs. This is what preservation requires. God will judge whether I was right. History will judge whether I was necessary. I can no longer judge myself at all. But Whitfield continued serving on the council, continued making decisions, continued signing rejection orders because the machine they'd built didn't allow for stepping away. You operated it, or it operated on you. There was no third option. The Children's House stood as New Providence's purest expression of its governing logic. Survival of the community required sacrifice of individuals, and if individuals wouldn't volunteer quickly enough, the community would make the sacrifice for them. Age, innocence, potential futures, these were luxuries that scarcity had eliminated. All that remained was the brutal calculus of consumption versus production, of who ate and who became food. By February of 1847, the colony had been sealed for 11 months. The population had been reduced from 400 to 217 through executions, sacrifices, starvation, and the systematic murder of children. The remaining colonists had eaten 63 of their neighbors through official channels and unknown numbers through the black market that thrived despite council regulation attempts. They'd achieved their goal. Supplies now exceeded consumption by a comfortable margin. They could survive indefinitely at current population levels. The Preservation Council had succeeded in preserving the community by destroying everything that made it worth preserving. But preservation was about to encounter a problem no council vote could solve. The first cases of what they called the wasting sickness appeared in mid-February. With symptoms the expedition's medical consultant would later identify as prion disease, the result of sustained human brain consumption causing fatal neurological degeneration. Victoria Ashford's hands wouldn't stop shaking by the third week of February. 1847, tremors that made writing difficult and holding utensils nearly impossible. She attributed it to stress, to exhaustion, to the weight of 11 months making decisions no human should make. But then William Chen, a field supervisor, developed the same tremors. Then Margaret Holloway. Then Thomas Whitfield himself, the man whose precise handwriting had documented every death, every rejection, every sacrifice. His final ledger entries wandered across pages like ants freed from formation, letters collapsing into illegible scratches. This was the colony's final lesson about consequences, delivered in the cruelest possible terms. Dr. Merrick's medical consultant, Dr. Raymond Phillips, examined the skeletal remains with particular attention to cranial damage patterns and bone degradation. His report, filed 6 months after the expedition concluded, identified clear signs of spongiform encephalopathy in 14 of the recovered skulls. The disease, similar to Kuru documented among the 4 people of Papua New Guinea, resulted from consuming human nervous tissue, particularly brain matter. The Preservation Council had been eating the most nutrient-dense portions of their victims, including organs and neural tissue, for nearly a year. Now their own brains were dissolving into sponge-like structures that robbed them of motor control, cognitive function, and eventually, life itself. They'd poisoned themselves with their own systematic cannibalism. The disease moved slowly at first, subtle enough to dismiss. A dropped cup, a forgotten name, difficulty with complex tasks. But by March, the symptoms accelerated with terrifying speed. Victoria Ashford's journal entries from early March showed someone losing their grip on language itself. The words are, "Thomas says we must. I cannot remember what. Hands, hands, hands won't. Rebecca is dead? No. Rebecca is. The children. I see them. They stand in corners. They don't speak. Grace asks for water, but there is no grace. There was never. I ate. We all. God, God, God. The entry ended mid-sentence, pen trailing off the page, as though Ashford had simply forgotten what writing was. Rebecca Stannard, who'd supervised the children's house, developed auditory hallucinations before the physical symptoms manifested. Colonists reported hearing her screaming in her quarters about children crying, though the children's house had been empty for months. She would wander the compound at night, calling names, offering food to empty air, having conversations with ghosts that only she could perceive. When the tremors started, she was already too lost in delusion to understand what was happening to her body. The expedition found her remains in her locked quarters, skeleton curled in a corner where she'd apparently tried to make herself as small as possible. Scratched into the wall above her were the words, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry," repeated 47 times. The handwriting degrading from recognizable letters into abstract marks that suggested she'd continued scratching long after language had left her. The island was collecting its debt. Thomas Whitfield's final coherent entry in the council ledger, dated March 18, 1847, exactly 1 year and 3 days after the gates closed, represented his last attempt at maintaining the bureaucratic order that had defined his administration. The sickness spreads. 7 confirmed cases among council and senior colonists. Cause unknown but suspected related to. We have made choices. We have done what preservation demanded. If this is judgment, then I accept judgment. But the others, the children Grace, I cannot. Request that any who find this understand, we were not monsters. We were not. We tried to. We only wanted to survive, to preserve to. The entry dissolved into illegible scrawls, as though Whitfield had continued trying to write even as his brain lost the ability to translate thought into language. Below the text, someone else had written in a different hand. Administrator Whitfield died March 21st, unable to walk or speak, did not recognize family at end. God grant him mercy where we could not. The disease created a crisis that overwhelmed the already fragile colony structure. As council members succumbed, authority collapsed. The careful rationing system broke down. The execution protocols couldn't be enforced by people who could no longer remember what they were enforcing. New Providence descended from organized atrocity into simple chaos. But the healthy colonists, those who'd avoided consuming neural tissue or had consumed less of it, faced an impossible situation. They were trapped behind sealed gates with people whose brains were literally destroying themselves, people who'd become unpredictable, violent, dangerous in their deterioration. The wasting sickness didn't kill quickly. It took months, leaving its victims suspended between life and death, awareness and oblivion. Patricia Chen found evidence of mercy killings in the final documents, dated April and May of 1847. Short notes between colonists coordinating to end the suffering of those too far gone to recover. Samuel can no longer feed himself. His children ask me to help. We'll do so tonight. Victoria tried to eat her own fingers. We cannot watch this anymore. Who will assist? The colony that had executed people for stealing fish now executed people out of compassion. A final bitter irony that the expedition members struggled to process. By June, the healthy colonists numbered approximately 140, facing the question that should have been asked a year earlier. Should they open the gates? The famine that had triggered the sealing had ended months ago. Supply ships had resumed their routes. The danger had passed. But opening the gates meant explaining what had happened inside them, meant facing questions about the 63 executed, the 93 starved, the 18 children systematically murdered. The debate split the survivors into 2 factions that the remaining documents called the confessors and the keepers. The confessors believed the only path forward was to open the gates, accept whatever punishment awaited, and rebuild their humanity through accountability. The keepers believed confession meant death sentences for everyone involved, that the only way to survive was to maintain the seal, bury the evidence, and create a unified story about plague or madness or natural disaster. Neither faction had the numbers or will to force their position on the other, so they did nothing, remaining sealed behind gates that no longer protected them from anything except consequence. The final document from New Providence was written by a woman named Catherine Moore on August 4th, 1847, 17 months after the gates closed. Moore had been a merchant's wife, someone whose name appeared nowhere in the council records, who'd apparently managed to survive by making herself invisible to the power structure that had consumed so many others. We are 73 now. The sickness has taken most of those who ate more than their share. Some call it justice. I call it biology, though justice and biology may be the same thing viewed from different angles. The gates remain sealed because we cannot agree on whether to open them. Marcus says we should burn everything and claim ignorance. Elena says we should preserve evidence and face trial. I say we are already on trial, have been since March of last year, and the verdict is being delivered in the form of trembling hands and dissolving minds. The children born here know nothing of what came before the gates. They are innocent. We are not. How do we raise innocent children in a place built on bones? How do we teach them right from wrong when we have defined wrong as survival and right as death? I no longer sleep in the compound. I have moved to the beach where I can hear waves and pretend they are washing away memory. They are not. Memory lives in the buildings, in the soil, in the bodies still locked in the storehouse because we lack the strength or will to bury them properly. Memory lives in the scratch marks on the children's house walls, in the altar where we convinced ourselves atrocity was sacrament, in the ledger that documents every name and date and decision that brought us here. If anyone finds this, know that we were not evil when we started. We were afraid, but fear is not excuse. Fear is explanation, not justification. We chose this. Every vote, every silence, every raised hand approving another death, we chose. And now we live with what we chose. Behind gates we sealed ourselves, in a prison of our own construction. The gates will never open, not because we cannot open them, but because we cannot face what opening them would mean. Catherine Moore's skeleton was found on the beach, 40 meters from the compound, facing the ocean. She'd apparently walked away from New Providence and simply sat down to wait for death, preferring to die alone than among the ghosts she'd helped create. But the gates didn't remain sealed by choice. The expedition discovered evidence of the final tragedy in charred timbers and melted metal near the gate mechanism. Sometime in late 1847 or early 1848, a fire had started in the meeting house. The exact cause unclear, but the spread devastatingly effective. The dry tropical timber, the close-packed buildings, the colonists too weak or ill to fight flames effectively, all combined into catastrophe. The fire created a terrible paradox. Colonists tried to open the gates to escape, but the iron had expanded in the heat, fusing the locking mechanism into permanent closure. The very barrier they'd erected to protect themselves from the outside world became the barrier that trapped them in an inferno. 63 skeletons were found in a cluster near the gates, piled on top of each other in a desperate crush of bodies trying to escape heat and smoke. Their bones showed no signs of wasting sickness, no evidence of execution or sacrifice. They were simply people who'd tried to run and found nowhere to run to. The gates they sealed became their tomb. The expedition spent 2 weeks documenting the fire damage, tracing burn patterns, reconstructing the colony's final hours. The evidence suggested the blaze had started at night, spread rapidly, and consumed most of the compound within hours. Some colonists had fled to the beach, like Catherine Moore. Others had tried to shelter in the storehouse, only to die of smoke inhalation among the skeletons of those who'd starved months earlier. A few had simply remained in their quarters, accepting fire as the final judgment they'd been avoiding. Dr. Merrick's final report estimated that approximately 20 colonists might have escaped the fire by swimming or rafting to nearby islands. But no records existed of New Providence survivors settling elsewhere, no stories of refugees appearing in port towns claiming to be from the sealed colony. If anyone escaped, they'd chosen to disappear completely rather than carry their story forward. New Providence burned in the darkness, visible from passing ships as an orange glow against the night sky. Several ship captains logged the fire, noting the island's location, but none investigated. The island had a reputation by then, stories of plague and madness that made approaching it seem like courting death. So, they sailed past, watching New Providence destroy itself, and continued to their destinations without stopping to help. One captain, David Rothschild, wrote in his log that he could hear screaming carried on the wind across the water, but he'd convinced himself it was birds or wind through trees, anything except what it actually was. I told myself no one lived there anymore, he wrote years later in his memoirs. I told myself the island was abandoned, but I knew, we all knew, and we sailed past anyway. The colony that had sealed itself away from the world discovered that the world was perfectly willing to seal itself away from them in return. The iron gates swung open on March 7, 1947, their hinges screaming after a century of silence. And Dr. Thomas Merrick stepped into what remained of human civilization's greatest argument against itself. The expedition had expected bones and ruins, the standard archaeology of failed settlements. What they found instead was a preserved crime scene, documents so carefully maintained they might have been filed yesterday, evidence of systematic atrocity organized with bureaucratic precision. New Providence hadn't simply collapsed into chaos. It had documented its own descent with the thoroughness of accountants balancing ledgers, creating an archive that would force the world to confront exactly how order becomes horror when survival trumps morality. The discovery created immediate controversy. The British Colonial Office, which had commissioned the expedition, moved to suppress the findings within weeks of receiving Merrick's preliminary report. The documents were classified, the site declared off-limits, and expedition members were required to sign non-disclosure agreements under threat of prosecution. The official explanation: protecting the dignity of the deceased and avoiding inflammatory historical material that might inflame racial or colonial tensions in the post-war period. The real reason was simpler and more damning. New Providence proved that British colonial ventures could fail not just economically, but morally, that the civilization the empire claimed to spread could dissolve into cannibalism and child murder within months under pressure. This wasn't a story about savage natives or tropical diseases. This was a story about white British colonists eating each other's children while maintaining careful records of their decisions. The empire didn't want that story told. Dr. Merrick fought the suppression for 3 years, writing letters to academic journals, attempting to publish findings through unofficial channels, speaking at conferences despite official warnings. His career suffered accordingly. By 1950, he'd been effectively blacklisted from major research institutions, his funding cut, his reputation damaged by whisper campaigns suggesting professional misconduct and unreliable methodology. Patricia Chen faced worse consequences. As a woman of Chinese descent working in a field dominated by white European men, her credibility was easier to attack. Rumors circulated that she'd fabricated evidence, that her translations of the documents were unreliable, that her emotional response to the Children's House had compromised her objectivity. She left archaeology entirely by 1952, taking a position teaching secondary school in Melbourne, where she never spoke publicly about New Providence again. Only Dr. Raymond Phillips, the medical consultant, managed to publish his findings about the prion disease, and only by divorcing it completely from the New Providence context. His paper on spongiform encephalopathy resulting from cannibalism appeared in a minor medical journal in 1953, attributed the research to a Pacific Island population without naming the location, and was largely ignored by the medical establishment for another decade. The suppression might have been permanent, except for one factor the Colonial Office hadn't anticipated. Other expedition members kept copies of documents, photographs, and personal journals that official censorship couldn't reach. These materials circulated underground among academics, journalists, and researchers who understood their significance even if they couldn't publish openly. One such document surfaced in 1968, leaked to a London newspaper by an anonymous source, later revealed to be Dr. Merrick's daughter. The newspaper published excerpts from Thomas Whitfield's ledger, alongside photographs of the execution circle, the storehouse skeletons, and the children's house. The headline read, "British Colonial Cannibalism, the story they tried to bury." The scandal forced partial declassification. The British government released heavily redacted files, acknowledging the expedition's basic findings while still suppressing the most damaging details. Academic access was granted under restricted conditions. Researchers could view materials only in government-controlled archives, couldn't photograph certain pages, and had to submit publications for pre-approval. These restrictions shaped how New Providence entered historical consciousness. Early studies focused on the famine conditions, the psychological pressure of isolation, the breakdown of social order under extreme stress. They treated New Providence as a tragedy of circumstances rather than choices, an unfortunate result of bad luck and desperation, rather than systematic decision-making by people who could have chosen differently at every stage. But the documents told a different story. Professor Helena Ashworth, no relation to Victoria Ashford, spent 15 years fighting for unrestricted archive access. Her 1989 book, The Preservation Machine, Bureaucracy and Atrocity at New Providence, used newly declassified materials to argue that the colony's horror resulted not from chaos, but from order, not from the absence of civilization, but from its perfect implementation. They didn't descend into savagery, Ashworth wrote. They ascended into it. Every execution was voted on. Every cannibalization was documented. Every child murder was approved through proper channels. New Providence wasn't civilization breaking down. It was civilization working exactly as designed when you strip away the moral foundations and leave only the procedural framework. Her argument proved controversial, particularly among historians who preferred to see New Providence as an aberration rather than a revelation. Debates raged in academic journals about whether the colony represented human nature under pressure or specifically British colonial psychology, whether it said something universal about humanity or particular about empire, whether its lessons applied to modern governance or remained safely historical curiosity. The debate missed what the survivors themselves had understood. New Providence wasn't about British people or colonial systems or specific historical conditions. It was about the ease with which normal people could be convinced to participate in horror if the horror was organized properly, justified thoroughly, and made participatory enough that refusing meant marking yourself as the next victim. Dr. Merrick died in 1976, having spent his final years compiling a comprehensive archive of New Providence materials that he donated to the University of Sydney, with the stipulation that it remain open to any serious researcher, regardless of government approval. His final interview, recorded 3 months before his death, contained a warning that subsequent events would prove prophetic. People study New Providence looking for what made those colonists different from us, he said. But the terrifying truth is, they weren't different. They were ordinary people who made ordinary choices under pressure. Each choice seeming reasonable in isolation, until the accumulation of reasonable choices produced unreasonable horror. That's the lesson. Evil doesn't require evil people. It just requires normal people who tell themselves they're doing what's necessary. The archive Merrick created became the foundation for second-generation New Providence research in the 1990s and 2000s. Scholars used the materials to study group psychology, moral decision-making under scarcity, the relationship between bureaucracy and atrocity, and the mechanisms through which ordinary people enable extraordinary harm. One particularly disturbing finding emerged from analysis of the execution attendance records. Researchers identified colonists who'd been present at multiple executions, tracking their participation over time. The pattern showed that attendance at the first execution predicted attendance at subsequent ones with 93% accuracy. Once someone had witnessed and tacitly approved one killing, they were overwhelmingly likely to approve the next, and the next, establishing a precedent of complicity that became self-reinforcing. The colony had weaponized the human tendency toward consistency. If you'd voted to execute Edmund Clark for stealing fish, how could you vote against executing Martha Brennan for spreading dissent without implicitly criticizing your first decision? Each execution made the next one easier to justify, because rejecting it meant acknowledging that all the previous ones had been wrong. They built horror from precedent. Modern psychology research on New Providence focused on the sacrifice program, which represented a particularly sophisticated form of coercion. By framing voluntary death as heroic rather than suicidal, the council had exploited the human need for meaning and dignity. People volunteered not because they wanted to die, but because the alternative, refusing while others sacrificed, would have marked them as selfish and cowardly in a community where social standing determined survival. The program had transformed suicide into a moral imperative, making it literally impossible to refuse without becoming a villain in your own story and everyone else's. This mechanism, researchers noted, appeared in various forms throughout history. Kamikaze pilots, suicide bombers, martyrdom cults, any system that convinced people their death served a higher purpose, while disguising the fact that the higher purpose was simply maintaining the system that demanded their death. Patricia Chen's grandniece, Dr. Sarah Chen, published a paper in 2009 analyzing the Children's House through the lens of modern child welfare policy. Her conclusion: the Council's developmental culling program followed a recognizable pattern seen in other cases of institutional child abuse, where bureaucratic language and systematic procedures were used to distance decision-makers from the human consequences of their decisions. They called it optimization of resource allocation for non-contributing minors, Chen wrote. They could have called it starving babies to death. But bureaucratic language serves a function. It allows people to do things they couldn't do if forced to describe those things honestly. Language becomes a buffer between action and awareness. Procedure becomes a buffer between decision and consequence. The paper won awards and renewed interest in New Providence among social workers and child protection advocates who recognized the patterns Chen described from their own work in failing institutions. The mechanisms that allowed New Providence colonists to systematically murder children, they realized, were the same mechanisms that allowed modern institutions to systematically neglect, abuse, or otherwise harm children, while everyone involved claimed to be following proper procedures. By 2015, New Providence had been thoroughly studied, exhaustively analyzed, and completely integrated into academic discourse about atrocity, complicity, and moral breakdown. It appeared in textbooks, documentaries, museum exhibits, and lecture series. The site itself had been declared a UNESCO heritage location, preserved as a memorial to the victims and a warning about the fragility of moral order. But something was missing from all this scholarship and memorialization: the voice of the 73 who'd survived the fire. Dr. Catherine Moore's skeleton sat facing the ocean for a century, but she hadn't been the last to leave New Providence alive. The evidence emerged gradually, piece by piece, from sources the official expeditions had never thought to check: parish records from small islands throughout the South Pacific, ship manifests from trading vessels, census documents from Australian coastal towns, birth certificates for children whose parents' origins were listed as unknown Pacific Island. By 2018, researchers had assembled a fragmentary but undeniable picture. At least 19 New Providence colonists had survived the fire and scattered across the Pacific, carrying their secrets into anonymous new lives. The breakthrough came from genealogical research. DNA databases that had revolutionized family history research inadvertently created a map of New Providence descendants. People searching for their ancestry discovered unexpected connections to others whose family trees terminated at the same mysterious point in the late 1840s, parents or grandparents who'd appeared from nowhere with suspicious gaps in their personal histories. One such descendant, Marcus Whitfield Price, traced his lineage back to a woman named Elizabeth Price, who'd arrived in Brisbane in 1849, claiming to be a widow from a failed colonial venture. Elizabeth had been 31 when she arrived, traveling with 2 young children and enough money to purchase a small shop. She never spoke about her past, deflected questions with practiced vagueness, and died in 1893, having successfully erased any connection to New Providence from the official record. Marcus discovered the truth through a box of letters hidden in his grandmother's attic, correspondence between Elizabeth and someone signing themselves only as R. The letters, written between 1849 and 1862, spoke in careful code about the island and those months and what we had to do to survive. One letter, dated April 3rd, 1853, was more explicit. I dreamed again of the children's house. I see their faces still. Though I never entered that building, I only watched it being filled and later watched it being emptied. Is that better or worse? To have not directly participated, but to have known and done nothing? We tell ourselves we had no choice, but we had choices at every step. We chose wrong. We chose survival over humanity. And now we live with these choices, these children we raise, who will never know what their mothers were capable of accepting. The letter was signed E. Cross-referencing, with expedition documents revealed that Elizabeth Price had been married to Michael Priest, whose wife Anna had been executed for attacking Rebecca Stannard. Elizabeth had been Anna's closest friend, had watched her friend die for defending her child, had accepted a ration portion of Anna's flesh because refusing meant joining her in execution. Elizabeth Price wasn't a monster. She was a woman who'd made the compromises necessary to survive, who'd raised her hand to approve executions because not raising it meant being executed, who'd watched children die because protecting them meant dying with them. She was ordinary. She was complicit. She was both victim and perpetrator in a system that made those categories meaningless. And she was far from alone. Researchers identified probable New Providence survivors in Perth, Auckland, Singapore, and San Francisco. They'd changed names, invented backstories, created entirely new identities to escape their past. Some had married and raised families. Others had remained isolated, unable to form intimate connections with people who didn't share their memories. A few had ended their own lives within years of escaping, suggesting that survival carried its own unbearable weight. One survivor left more substantial evidence. A manuscript discovered in a Wellington archive in 2020, donated anonymously in 1973, with instructions that it remain sealed for 50 years. The 300-page handwritten document was titled simply Testimony and signed with the initials R.S. Rebecca Stannard had survived the fire. The woman who'd supervised the children's house, who'd watched 18 babies starve to death under her care, who'd developed the wasting sickness from consuming contaminated flesh, had somehow survived long enough to escape New Providence and live another 46 years. Her testimony provided the only detailed survivor account of the colony's final months and the psychological mechanisms that had allowed normal people to participate in systematic atrocity. I write this not as confession, but as warning, Stannard began. Not because I seek forgiveness, which I do not deserve, but because those who do not understand how this happened will allow it to happen again. You who read this in whatever future exists beyond my death, you who think yourselves incapable of what we did, you are wrong. You are as capable as we were. That is the horror. That is the lesson. Stannard's manuscript described the incremental nature of moral collapse. The first execution had required extensive debate, multiple votes, lengthy justification. By the 20th execution, the process had become routine, requiring 15 minutes and minimal discussion. The system had normalized itself through repetition, each precedent making the next step easier until what had once been unthinkable became standard procedure. We told ourselves we were preserving the community, she wrote, but the community we preserved bore no resemblance to the community we'd been. We preserved the buildings, the population count, the bureaucratic structure. We did not preserve compassion, mercy, love, or any quality that makes community worth preserving. We saved the shell and killed the soul, then called it success, because the shell still stood. Her description of the Children's House was devastating in its honesty. She didn't attempt to minimize her role or deflect responsibility. She'd volunteered to supervise the facility because someone had to, because refusing would have meant questioning council authority, because accepting meant continued high-value rations that kept her own children alive. I murdered 18 babies to save 2, she wrote. I tell myself this was necessary, that any mother would make such choices, that survival justifies sacrifice. But these are lies I tell myself to sleep at night. The truth is simpler and worse. I murdered 18 babies because I valued my children more than other people's children, and the system allowed me to act on that valuation. The system rewarded me for it, and I accepted the reward. Stannard described developing the wasting sickness in March of 1847, watching her hands begin to shake, knowing what it meant. She'd hidden her symptoms as long as possible, terrified that showing weakness would mean losing her position and protections. By the time the fire started, she could barely walk, could hardly speak coherently, and had resigned herself to dying with the colony she'd helped destroy. But the fire had created a moment of absolute chaos where normal surveillance broke down. In the panic and confusion, with colonists rushing toward gates that wouldn't open and buildings collapsing into flame, Stannard had simply walked away. She'd stumbled through smoke to the beach, found a small boat that someone had already launched, and climbed in without knowing or caring who else was aboard. 4 colonists escaped in that boat. Stannard, Elizabeth Price, a man whose name Stannard never learned, and a teenager named David something or other. They'd rowed through the night, away from the flames consuming New Providence, toward open ocean without plan or destination. The unnamed man had died of smoke inhalation before dawn. David had fallen overboard during a storm 2 days later, exhausted and unable to hold on when waves swept the boat. Stannard and Price had drifted for 6 days before a trading vessel picked them up, dehydrated and delirious but alive. They'd told the captain they were survivors from a merchant ship that had foundered in storms, refugees from a tragedy that had no connection to the burning island visible on the horizon behind them. The captain, uninterested in complications, had accepted their story and deposited them in Brisbane with minimal questions. Elizabeth and I parted ways at the dock, Stannard wrote. We had survived together but could not live together. Every time I looked at her, I saw Anna Priest being executed. Every time she looked at me, she saw the Children's House. We were mirrors, reflecting what we wished to forget. So we created new names, new histories, new lives built on the foundation of erased memory. Stannard had moved to Wellington, married a merchant who never asked about her past, and raised 3 children who grew up believing their mother had emigrated from England after her first husband died of consumption. She never told them about New Providence, never mentioned the Children's House, never spoke about the 18 babies or the wasting sickness or the night the island burned. but she dreamed about it constantly. Her manuscript contained dream journals spanning decades, nightmares that evolved but never ceased. The children asking for water. Thomas Whitfield's shaking hands, trying to write coherent sentences. The smell of cooking flesh from the altar. The sound of the storehouse door being barred. The sight of small toys scattered across the children's house floor. "I have survived 69 years," she wrote, in what appeared to be the manuscript's final entry, dated November 18, 1913. "I have been a wife, a mother, a respected community member. I have lived a good life by any external measure. But I have not lived a good life. I have lived a life built on buried children and suppressed memory. Every moment of happiness has been theft from those who died so I could live. Every achievement has been purchased with their sacrifice. I survived, but I did not escape. No one escapes New Providence. We only carry it forward." Rebecca Stannard died in 1914. Cause of death listed as heart failure. Her children, clearing her effects, found the manuscript and were horrified by its contents. They debated destroying it, unwilling to believe their respectable mother had participated in such atrocities. Eventually, they compromised. Donated anonymously to an archive with instructions for delayed access, allowing the testimony to exist while protecting the family from association with it. The testimony lay buried for 60 years, while descendants lived in ignorance. The manuscript's release in 2023 created immediate controversy. Descendants of verified New Providence survivors objected to their ancestors being identified, arguing that people who'd spent their lives hiding their past deserved to have that wish respected even after death. They organized legally to prevent publication of names, to restrict genealogical research, to limit any scholarship that might connect specific modern individuals to historical New Providence colonists. The debate raised uncomfortable questions about responsibility across generations. Were descendants obligated to acknowledge their ancestors' participation in atrocity? Did they inherit guilt along with genetic material? Should the truth be preserved even when it caused pain to living people who'd done nothing wrong except be born to parents or grandparents who'd survived by participating in systematic murder? Professor James Rothschild, descendant of the ship captain who'd sailed past the burning island, argued that descendants had a moral obligation to acknowledge history rather than suppress it. "My ancestor heard people screaming and chose not to help," he wrote in an editorial. "I am not responsible for his choice, but I am responsible for how I respond to learning about it." Silence enables repetition. The only way to prevent future New Providences is to face past New Providences honestly, including the parts that implicate our own families. Others disagreed. Marcus Whitfield Price, whose ancestor Elizabeth had survived by compromising her principles, wrote that forcing descendants to publicly claim connection to New Providence served no purpose except inflicting pain. "My great-great-grandmother did what she had to do to survive," he argued. "Judging her from comfortable distance accomplishes nothing except making us feel morally superior. She lived through hell. We live in air conditioning. Perhaps we should show some humility." The debate remained unresolved, reflecting deeper tensions about how societies should remember historical atrocities and whether individual survival under impossible conditions should be judged by people who never faced such conditions. But while descendants argued about memory and responsibility, researchers made one final discovery that reframed everything the expedition had found. The archaeological team returned to New Providence in 2021, using ground-penetrating radar and modern forensic techniques unavailable to Dr. Merrick's 1947 expedition. They discovered a network of tunnels beneath the compound, hand-dug passages connecting major buildings to hidden chambers that had escaped previous detection. The chambers contained supplies, preserved food still edible after nearly 2 centuries, fresh water in sealed cisterns, medical equipment, tools, weapons. enough resources to sustain 200 people for at least 3 years, possibly longer with careful rationing. The colony had never been in danger of starvation. The gates had never needed to close. Dr. Sarah Chen led the excavation, bringing her grandaunt Patricia's field journals as both guide and memorial. What they found in the deepest chamber challenged every assumption about New Providence's history. A meeting room with chairs arranged in a circle, walls covered in writing, and at the center, a metal box containing documents that predated the supposed famine by 6 months. The documents were meeting minutes from a secret gathering of Colonial Development Company directors held in London in September of 1845. The minutes detailed a plan to use New Providence as a social experiment in resource management under controlled scarcity conditions. The company was failing financially, unable to profit from Pacific ventures as projected. Rather than admit failure, they decided to study how isolated populations responded to artificial resource pressure. The famine had been manufactured. Supply ships had been deliberately diverted. Communications had been intercepted and altered. The entire crisis that triggered the gate closing had been orchestrated by company directors who wanted to observe how a self-contained population would manage under extreme conditions. They'd even planted Thomas Whitfield as colony administrator, specifically for his bureaucratic mindset, believing he'd document the results with useful precision. The experiment will provide valuable data on population control measures, resource allocation efficiency, and the minimum viable social infrastructure required for colonial sustainability. The minutes read, anticipated outcomes include reduced population through natural attrition, development of innovative survival strategies, and documentation of behavioral patterns under sustained pressure. Financial cost, minimal. Scientific value, substantial. The Colonial Development Company had turned 400 people into laboratory subjects without their knowledge or consent, creating artificial scarcity to study how they'd respond, then abandoned them when the experiment produced data too horrifying to publicize. New Providence wasn't a tragedy. It was a trial. The revelation reframed everything the expedition had documented. The executions, the cannibalism, the children's house, all of it had resulted from a manufactured crisis designed to produce exactly such outcomes. The company had wanted to know how far civilization could degrade under pressure. New Providence had answered comprehensively. Dr. Chen's analysis of the company minutes revealed something even more disturbing. The directors had anticipated cannibalism as a likely outcome and had considered it a success rather than a failure. The development of alternative protein consumption strategies under resource scarcity demonstrates admirable adaptability. One director had written, such data may prove invaluable for future long-duration colonial or maritime ventures where traditional food supplies become unavailable. They'd viewed the systematic consumption of human flesh as useful information about managing future colonies. The children dying in the children's house had been acceptable losses in pursuit of data about population reduction efficiency. The wasting sickness that destroyed colonist brains had been an unfortunate complication, but one that still provided medical insights about the limits of alternative nutrition sources. The Colonial Development Company had dissolved in 1851, its assets sold to cover debts. The directors had moved on to other ventures, carrying their New Providence data with them, but never facing consequences for what they'd orchestrated. Some had gone on to distinguished careers in colonial administration, bringing their insights about resource management to policy decisions that affected millions of people across the British Empire. The company's secret documents had been buried beneath New Providence itself, hidden in chambers that the colonists apparently discovered during the final months. Someone, probably during the chaos before the fire, had broken into the chambers and found proof that their suffering had been deliberately manufactured. They'd left the evidence for future discovery, understanding that they wouldn't survive to tell the story themselves, but that the truth might eventually surface. A handwritten note attached to the company minutes, dated July 8, 1847, conveyed the colonists' final message in Victoria Ashford's deteriorating handwriting. To whoever finds this, we were test subjects in an experiment we never consented to. Everything we did, everything we became, resulted from lies we were told, and scarcity that was manufactured. This does not excuse our choices. We executed innocent people. We ate our neighbors. We murdered children. These were our decisions, made by our hands, justified by our words. But understand that our decisions were made in response to conditions deliberately created to produce exactly such decisions. The directors who designed this experiment believed they were studying abstract principles of resource management and population control. They viewed us as data points rather than human beings. They created conditions that would strip away our civilization, and then documented how thoroughly civilization could be stripped. They succeeded, we failed, and in our failure, we revealed exactly what they wanted to prove, that humans under sufficient pressure will abandon every principle, betray every value, and consume each other, both literally and figuratively, if convinced such consumption is necessary for survival. But here is what the experiment also proved. The people who designed it were more monstrous than the monsters they created. We killed with our hands. They killed with policy. We consumed flesh. They consumed lives. We descended into horror over 11 months. They planned horror in comfortable offices and called it science. If you judge us, and you should judge us, remember to judge them as well. Remember that creating conditions for atrocity is itself atrocity. Remember that observing evil without intervention is participation in evil. Remember that the greatest horrors are committed not by individuals who lose their humanity, but by institutions that never claimed to have humanity in the first place. The note continued for 3 pages, describing how the colonists had discovered the tunnels in June, had found the supplies that could have saved them, had learned that their suffering had been engineered. Some had wanted to simply end their lives immediately upon learning the truth. Others had wanted to preserve evidence. The final consensus had been to leave the documents in place, to create a record that might eventually expose what had been done to them. "We will not survive to see justice," Ashford wrote, "but perhaps you will deliver it in our memory. Not justice for us. We deserve none. Justice for the principle that human beings should not be treated as experimental subjects. Justice for the idea that creating suffering to study suffering is itself the worst form of suffering. Justice for the children who died in the Children's House, who died because directors in London wanted data about population management efficiency. If there is a future, if there is a civilization that survives beyond this island and this experiment, let our story serve as warning. Systems that treat people as resources will eventually consume those people entirely. Whether the consumption happens with knives and hunger or with spreadsheets and policy makes no difference to those being consumed. The mechanism changes. The result remains the same. We sealed ourselves behind these gates, thinking we were protecting ourselves from famine. We were actually sealing ourselves into a laboratory where our suffering would be measured and recorded. Do not make our mistake. Do not trust that those in authority have your survival in mind when they ask you to make sacrifices. Do not believe that necessity justifies atrocity. Do not assume that procedure protects against horror. We made all these assumptions. Every skeleton on this island testifies to where such assumptions lead. The note ended with a list of all 7 Colonial Development Company directors' names and addresses, a final act of exposure from people who knew they'd never live to confront their tormentors, but could at least ensure history knew who to blame. Dr. Chen's team spent 8 months verifying the document's authenticity, confirming that the company minutes matched the company's official records, cross-referencing the directors' names with historical archives. Every detail checked out. The manufactured famine, the deliberate isolation, the experiment in human degradation. All of it was documented, verified, undeniable. The British government issued an official apology in 2022, acknowledging that the Colonial Development Company, operating under Crown Charter, had conducted unauthorized human experimentation, resulting in the deaths of at least 381 people. The apology came 175 years too late to matter to anyone who'd suffered, but it at least established official recognition of what had occurred. Descendants of the company directors were located and interviewed. Some expressed shock and horror at their ancestors' actions. Others defended them, arguing that 19th century ethics differed from modern standards and that judging historical figures by contemporary values was unfair. A few simply refused to comment, unwilling to acknowledge any connection to New Providence at all. The revelation that the colony's suffering had been manufactured didn't absolve the colonists of their choices, but did contextualize those choices within a framework of systematic manipulation. They'd been placed in an impossible situation by people who wanted to study how they'd fail, then blamed for failing, exactly as predicted. The experiment's designers had created conditions for atrocity, and then documented the atrocity as though they bore no responsibility for engineering it. They'd built the machine and blamed the gears for turning. Modern ethicists studying New Providence identified it as an extreme example of what happens when human beings are treated as means rather than ends, as experimental subjects rather than moral agents. The Colonial Development Company had violated every principle of ethical research, consent, and human dignity. But more disturbingly, they'd done so using the same bureaucratic structures and rational justifications that the colonists themselves would later use to justify their executions and cannibalism. The experiment and its results were mirrors of the same logic. Survival or knowledge, or progress or efficiency, could justify treating people as resources to be consumed in pursuit of abstract goals. The company had consumed the colonists' lives for data. The colonists had consumed each other's flesh for survival. Both believed themselves justified by necessity. Both were wrong. New Providence's final lesson was this: creating systems that dehumanize people will produce dehumanized outcomes, whether those systems are designed by corporate directors in London offices or by desperate colonists behind sealed gates. The specific conditions change. The underlying mechanism remains constant. Treat people as things, and they will eventually treat each other as things. Build machines that require human sacrifice, and those machines will find people willing to perform the sacrifice. The island site is now a memorial and museum, preserved exactly as the 2021 expedition found it. Visitors walk through the compound, see the execution circle, enter the storehouse, visit the children's house. They read the documents, study the ledgers, learn the names of every person who died and how they died. They descend into the tunnels and see the supplies that could have saved lives if the truth had been known earlier. And at the center of the memorial, in the meeting house, where so many votes were taken and so many deaths approved, visitors encounter Victoria Ashford's final note displayed behind glass. The last paragraph has been reproduced on a plaque visible from everywhere in the compound. We built a machine from procedure and fear. We fed it our neighbors and called it preservation. We maintained perfect records of our descent and called it order. We convinced ourselves that necessity justified nightmare and that survival excused all sins. We were wrong. You who visit this place, you who read these words, remember, the machine is always waiting to be built. The procedures are always ready to be followed. The justifications are always available. The only protection is refusing to build, refusing to follow, refusing to accept that any outcome justifies consuming human beings in its pursuit. Remember us as a warning. Remember what we became when we forgot this. Remember and refuse. Some say the island is haunted. that visitors hear children crying from the children's house at night, that shadows move through the compound when no one's there. The locals claim you can still smell cooking meat from the altar area when the wind blows wrong, that the gates sometimes appear sealed, even though they stand permanently open now. One maintenance worker swears he saw a woman in 19th century dress standing at the beach, looking out to sea, though she vanished when he approached. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.